Right. Abby is a biologist in the Science, Analytics and Synthesis program of USGS. We invited Abby here to share her insights as a manager of some of the most critical global data platforms of our time, including GBIF and OBIS, as well as her experience leading efforts in advancing the adoption of data standards, which have been widely recognized as a major challenge and need in this space. So Abby, we're really excited to have you here and interested to hear your thoughts. Do you want to take it away?
Great. Yep. Happy to take it away. So what I am excited to talk to you guys about today are community and standards are the backbone to integrated species observations. And so, yeah, great. Steph already did an introduction for me, so I'll just move right along here. So it's always fun to start off with this very beautiful picture where you can clearly see all those red places where we have a lot of observations of species. These are coming from multiple data providers across organizations, globally, across nodes. So lots of people contributing this data. And you can see, first you see the red and the orange, but then you see the blue and the greens, and you realize we still have work to do to really have a full picture of species out there. And also taxonomically, there are gaps there too that I think this community would really be poised to fill. And so what we're trying to do is provide biodiversity evidence for research and policy. So there's lots of people out there, lots of different ways of collecting data. It's coming from museums, it's coming from governments, universities, citizen science. So we're all collecting this data, right? And it's multiple forms. So it's specimens, it's human observations, it's machine observations like you all would have, literature, remote sensing, DNA. So all different types of ways of trying to observe the species on our planet. And what really makes this so that we can integrate it together and have like a shared resource are open licenses and standards. So using standards means that we can integrate these data sets from all these different places using all these different ways of collecting data. We can integrate them together into a shared index like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility Global Index. And then once they're integrated, we can share it out through cloud services, through gbif.org, and also through APIs. So making it available in multiple ways for research and for policy. So lots of different analyses out there and research going on using these data and creating indicators, as well as policy bodies really needing this information and what they're doing. And so who really needs this data? Well, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, is one such body that uses this data in the assessments they're doing on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they need data across multiple data sets, across organizations in order to really answer the questions that they're trying to answer. Similarly, there's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have targets that we're trying to meet. And if we're going to say how we're doing towards those targets, we're going to need data to do that. And it's going to come from multiple places, and it's going to need to be integrated together. And then there's also the 2020, the Global Biodiversity Framework, following on from the Aichi targets, where we also have that need for understanding at national and global scales. And data integration enables global biodiversity synthesis. So here's a paper by Heberling et al. Out last year, just showing the wide range of ways that these data are used across biodiversity analysis across that research field, but also into chemistry and physics. There's so many ways these data are being used for understanding our world, and it's really exciting. So my favorite example of how these data are being used to inform policy is this IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. In this report, they cited a paper that used more than 385 million GBIF mediated occurrence records to analyze the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius and how that would affect geographic range losses due to climate change. And what it will do is it'll cut them in half. So the way they were able to do this analysis is they were able to go to GBIF, download so many observations of species, run these analyses, and then this paper gets used in these policymaking reports that are needed for our understanding at these global scales and national scales. And there's lots of different ways that this is being used. So, here's just an assortment of conservation ways that the data in GBIF are being used, from assessing gaps in protected areas of Brazil to assessing biases and broader applicability of expert range maps. So just lots of ways to use the data, and these are just a few, but I'm sure you all could think of much of more. And so, okay, I'm excited. Let's get our data in here so it can be used. How do I do it? Well, for GBIF, one of the main standards that are used is Darwin Core. So what this does is, let's say we have 3 different data sets, they're all formatted differently. You transform them to Darwin Core, then all the column headers are the same, and the information in those columns is following the standard. So this means that we can integrate them together, and then researchers and policymakers can perform observation level extraction. So if they really just want to know about a particular region, or they're only interested in certain taxa, you can do that because the data are following standards. And so you can actually grab those out and do the analyses that you're wanting to do. And so, okay, we've integrated the data, it's available. One of the ways I wanted to highlight for you all that it's accessible is through cloud computing services. So GBIF provides snapshots of the data to Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google BigQuery. And so this means that any data that you shared to GBIF would be available in these cloud services and would be integrated together with other data like citizen science and any other data sets that might be in there on climate data, other forms of data that you would want to merge this with, environmental data that you would want to do these kind of big analyses with. One other thing I wanted to highlight for you about what GBIF is doing, here's a data set that USGS published back in 2017, and GBIF is doing some pretty innovative data citation tracking. So you can see there's 133 citations for this data set. And what GBIF does is when you go in and as a researcher or someone using the data, you go in and you select a subset of the data that you want to use. You get, and let's say that's coming from 500 different data sets. Well, you get one DOI that's specific to that subset of data that you can cite in your paper. And when you cite that in a paper, all of those 500 data sets get credit, get linked to that paper to say this was how this data is being used. So what's nice about that is you don't really want to cite 500 DOIs. That's going to be kind of hard to do. So having one DOI, but still the credit goes to the 500 different data providers is really innovative and makes it easy to do. And so if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this presentation, if you're using someone else's data, make sure to cite the DOI. It's really important that people get credit for doing this work of sharing their data. And so my take-home messages for you today are that big questions require big data, and that data is going to come from multiple sources. We're really going to need to integrate across projects, across all these different organizations in order to be able to answer the big questions we need and we need to use standards to do that. Standards is what makes that possible. Integrated and openly accessible movement data will improve our understanding of global biodiversity and feed into research and policy making. You here have an opportunity to really fill those data gaps, and there's really not very much machine observation data in GBIF yet. So this is a big opportunity, and I think it can make a really big difference. And the community is what makes this work. This is a bunch of people working together, deciding to do things the same way, deciding to use Darwin Core as a standard. And so when we work together, we can accomplish really great things, I think. And I did put a little note at the bottom here to highlight that there is a guide to sensitive species occurrences, because I saw a question about that from one of the participants. So there is a way to share the data even for sensitive species, and there's a guide on how to do that. So, so maybe check that out, and I can talk more about it if needed. So that's it for me, and I will stop sharing.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, Abby. To get us started, I wanted to throw to a question one of our earlier speakers asked as she registered for this this topic. It was Melinda Holland from Wildlife Computers, and asked, what can the community do to get metadata standards accepted? Because standardized metadata allows data to be findable. Do you have any thoughts?
Excuse me. Yes, I have thoughts. Use standards that are already existing. Please don't create your own. There's already standards out there, and they're already approved, and they're already being used. And so I didn't put up the XKCD comic where it's like, we need a standard to do this. And then, you know, there's 14 standards, and at the end there's 15 standards. But if there is like a different standard that you really, there are standards bodies out there. So TADWIG is the standards body that oversees Darwin Core. There's ISO. So there are standards bodies if you really want to get, you know, push that through to get a new standard approved. But I would encourage everyone to use existing standards and contribute to them and participate in them and add what doesn't work for you, and try to integrate in with the existing standards so that we're not developing a new one. We're making sure the ones that exist work for your data.
Another question. Oh, sorry.
Can I add something to that? So one thing, I think sometimes people look at standards that exist and they're like, well, it doesn't fit my exact thing. And so I think that like with TEDWIG in particular, like they've got GitHub stuff, go in and ask questions, go in and suggest things. And a big part where, you know, as movement ecology, how we engage with that is we may need to collectively figure out, here's the protocol you do for using this standard. And there might be some ways of using the standard that might be unique to us. And so in the case of biologging data, we actually have quite a bunch of, we've made some like progress on that. Like, how do we use Darwin Core? How do we apply it to our data? And so that's the conversation, and that's all public on GitHub. I can post some links. So that's a conversation that can happen, and that could lead to like movement ecology or for camera trapping could adopt the standard, right? So a data platform could adopt the standard, and then they could publish a shared, here's how we all use it. And that's the thing that can happen at a community level that means that we don't have to make a new standard. But we can make our own way for how we use the existing standard. And that's what I think then maybe we feel more like invested in it and it becomes more useful.
Yeah, that's something that came through in some of the focus groups discussions we had in the State of Conservation Tech, that like the way to get data standards like propagated through the community is by working with the tech companies and the tech developers, and to align with the standards that already exist. Seems to echo what you're saying, Sarah. I just have one more question. One of your slides, Abby, you mentioned, you gave a nod to the planetary computer and a lot of the tech company-led initiatives in this space. I was wondering if there are any concerns, or I always wonder if, who should be leading those efforts, and if it's an independent, if there are any concerns around the involvement of the big tech companies and them pushing the way forward in standards and data collection and curation and storage, and whether we should be concerned about anything. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say that, you know, I think GBIS sees those as an opportunity for a way to get the data used rather than tech companies saying how the data should be formatted or anything like that. I mean, the data, the snapshots that are shared are using Darwin Core. And so, you know, the big tech companies aren't necessarily telling us how we should be, you know, formatting our data. But it is a big opportunity because these are big data. I mean, there are over 2 billion occurrence records in GBIF. And if you're going to analyze that, you're going to need kind of a big computer to do that if you're going to do all of them. So, and with movement ecology, if, you know, there will be a lot more. So having ways to do that efficiently, I think will be a good thing. But yeah, you know, I think there are always some concerns about how to do that well. And so hopefully, I think it's being done well, but I would like to hear from others if that's not the case. So.
We might bring that up in the group discussion. Okay, thank you so much, Abby. I'm going to call on Rafael next.